At about 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a scream. Long, drawn out, and filled with terror. This wasn't just a startled cry. It was a scream of pure, unrestrained fear, like someone was fighting for their life. And it was coming from the apartment below mine. Tonight on Gloom Station, I'm going to share a chilling tale from a subscriber. It's a series of unsettling and terrifying nights that took place in January of 2010 in a small town just north of Atlanta, Georgia. But before we dive in, I want to remind you of something important. When things go wrong, when fear grips us, we don't always think straight. We don't act the way we think we would when we're sitting comfortably safe in our own homes. Fear has a way of distorting our judgment, clouding our instincts. It's only later, when the adrenaline has subsided, that we realize how reckless and irrational we were when we were scared. Just keep that in mind. For now, I suggest you find a quiet space, dim the lights, and let yourself sink into the unknown as you listen closely. I'd lived in my apartment for 7 months. It was nice enough, and by that point I had already decided to re-sign my lease. The building was a simple 2-story complex, 4 units per building, with a breezeway connecting everyone's doors. The setup was perfect for someone like me, someone who wasn't particularly social. I mostly kept to myself, just waving occasionally whenever I saw the other tenants. It was a nice, quiet building. You see, in apartment complexes, you never know who you're going to get living next to you. You might get those miserable neighbors who call the cops at the drop of a hat, or you might end up with the party animals who blast music at all hours of the night, like those dill holes across the lot. If you are either of those types, I probably hate you on principle. But for the most part, living close to people isn't so bad. One evening, I came home from work to find a moving truck parked in the lot. Turned out to be for the apartment below mine. When they came out as I was walking up to the building, I did the neighborly thing and asked, "Oh man, you guys leaving?" Even though in the 7 months of living here, I'd barely spoken to them. It was a man and his wife carrying a mattress out. They smiled and did the half-tilt head thing, then said they'd purchased a house across town. I wished them the best, then I went on to my apartment. I'm obviously wondering at this point, what kind of person is going to move in? Would they be multiple people, or just one? Would they be young or old, loud or quiet? Would they have kids, or would they go to bed early? These are the questions people wish they could ask folks before they're allowed to move in. But really, we have no say over who gets to live so close to us. We don't get to decide who gets to sleep on the other side of the wall. The apartment underneath mine was only empty for a week. On the 8th day, I saw another moving truck parked in the lot. I didn't stick around since I figured I would see the new tenant sooner or later. Around 9 p.m., I stepped out onto my balcony for a cigarette. I was trying to quit, but the habit still clung to me like an old friend who just wouldn't leave. As I stood there, I spotted my new neighbor. She was carrying a garbage bag to the dumpster. I did my best to look around without being noticed, but I did see that she was older than me, maybe in her late 30s. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like she was either lost in thought or maybe just zoned out, probably exhausted from her day of moving in. When she walked back to the building, she didn't look up, and I didn't say anything to get her attention. I went back inside, locked the sliding door, and settled in for the night. At about 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a scream, a long, drawn-out, and filled with terror scream. It wasn't just a startled cry. This was a scream of pure, unrestrained fear, like someone was fighting for their life, and it was coming from the apartment below mine. I hesitated for a mere second with my heart pounding, asking myself, what should I do? I reacted. I grabbed the self-defense tool I kept in my drawer, not knowing if it would help, and I rushed out of my apartment, barefoot, stumbling down the stairs. The night air was cold against my skin, and my hands were shaking with anxiety. I reached her door, but before I could knock, I froze. What the hell am I doing here? The question rang in my head, but there was really no time to think about it now. So I pounded on the door. My fist hit against the metal door that had been painted a dull wood color. What if she's really in danger, I thought. But then another thought hit me. What if I'm rushing into something dangerous? What if I'm making things worse? The door didn't open. A horrible sinking feeling crept over me. Maybe I was already too late. Maybe she... Just as I was about to knock again, I heard the creak of the door being pulled open slightly. Just enough for the chain lock to keep it shut. Her face appeared through the gap, pale and wide-eyed, clearly shook by whatever was happening. My voice was shaking with urgency, but still I asked, "Are you okay?" She stared at me for a moment before blinking and responding almost blankly. "What's going on?" "I heard you scream," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I lowered it and asked quietly, "Do you need me to call the police?" She frowned. Confusion crossed her face as she assured me that she had been asleep just moments ago. The only reason she was up at all was because I had just banged on her door so intensely. I didn't fully believe her. I thought maybe someone had made her say that. The thought crept into my mind, but what could I really do? I couldn't force my way in. All I could do was apologize, even though it felt completely wrong. I wished her a good night and headed back upstairs, my heart still pounding in my chest. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept replaying her face in my mind, trying to imagine if the expression on her face was genuine. After some time, I decided it had just been a misunderstanding, so I allowed myself to fall back asleep. The next morning when I left for work, I was coming down the stairs towards my car when I heard her say, "Hey." I turned and she was locking her door, clearly on her way out as well. Since she had been the one to call out to me, I felt it was the right time to apologize again. She was super polite about it all. She said that she appreciated the idea, but hoped it wouldn't happen again for either of us. She was incredibly cool about it. I apologized again, but she just nodded, saying she really did appreciate my concern. She seemed fine, too, like nothing had happened. Something about that didn't sit right with me. I went about my day convinced that it was just some kind of misunderstanding, maybe even a nightmare on my part. But the next night it happened again. I was woken by the same scream, high-pitched, full of fear. I jumped up immediately, but this time I forced myself to remain calmer. I stepped out onto my balcony, listening intensely. I couldn't hear anything. There were no sounds, and no lights came on in the windows below. I carefully, and creepily, went to her door and tried to listen through it. Nothing. The night was quiet, peaceful. But why was I hearing this scream, and where were the other neighbors? Surely I'm not the only one investigating a scream. But with nothing else to do, I went back to my room and went to sleep. Another day came and went. Just the usual work, dinner, another show, another bedtime, and yes, another night of being woken up by a single high-pitched scream of horror. This time I sat up instead of jumping up, and I started to ask myself questions. The first was this: am I really hearing it, or am I imagining it? Am I dreaming it? If so, why now? And why does it sound so clearly like it's coming from the apartment underneath mine? Next, I asked if she really is screaming once each night. Why doesn't she know it? I concluded that if she was doing it but didn't know it, maybe she had night terrors. Or maybe she was schizophrenic and truly didn't know she was doing it. Hell, maybe I was schizophrenic. Next, I asked why didn't the scream wake anyone else up, and for that I actually decided that they were all just smarter than me. They were all smart enough not to get involved. Either way, I stayed in bed and listened for another scream that never came. On the fourth night of being woken by a scream, I was less worried and more annoyed. I decided that even though the situation was incredibly awkward, and I had already started off on the wrong foot with her, tomorrow I was going to talk to her and tell her exactly what's been going on every night since she moved in. After deciding this, I let myself fall back asleep. But this time I woke up to hard knocks at my door. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was real, or if I dreamed it. But they did come again. I looked through the peephole and saw two cops, their faces grim. I opened the door and they didn't waste any time asking me if I'd seen or heard anything suspicious tonight. The first thing I did was ask if everything was alright. They didn't answer. They just asked me again if I'd seen or heard anything. Given the last few nights, I told them exactly what had been happening. All about the screams, and how she denied ever doing it. They exchanged a look before one of them asked why I hadn't called them already. This made me more concerned, so I asked what's going on. Why were they here? The other officer finally spoke, his voice steady but heavy as he told me that the woman living below me had been attacked. Someone had broken into her apartment, and she woke up to see this intruder standing in her bedroom doorway. She managed to scream only once before the intruder stopped her and held her captive for over 20 minutes, only leaving when the cops banged on her door. The horror of it hit me like a cold wave. She had actually been trapped. The scream was real this time. The officers took my statement, but ultimately there wasn't much they could do about it. The woman moved out the next day, and I don't blame her. That had to have been traumatizing. To this day, I don't know what happened those 3 nights before her attack. Had it all just been my imagination? Was it a premonition? Had something been trying to warn me? I can't stop asking myself why I didn't do more. Why didn't I call the police? Any of those nights. I'm still left with more questions than answers, but the biggest one is this. Were those screams meant to warn me, or were they meant to prepare me for that night? Thank you for listening to the story, and I hope you enjoy the content here on Gloom Station. In the upcoming videos, Gloom Station will be branching out into different types of horror. I'll be sharing original creepypastas as well as continuing these short-form horror stories. I've also written several books available on Amazon, and I'll leave them linked in the description below. But that's all for now. Stay safe out there.